about climate change, which sees it as more as about individual behaviour. So it says, okay, well, if you're producing, if you're responsible for too much greenhouse gas emissions, you need to cut back, then you just need to persuade people to buy fewer things. And actually then this is a rather austerity agenda. You're saying, well, actually the problem is individual consumption, people should just cut back, stop being so selfish, stop buying so much stuff and so on. And that's therefore the solution to climate change. And that's also actually rather an austerity agenda. But what I'm going to argue is that although governments want us to see the solutions to climate change in individual lifestyle changes, it's actually all about infrastructure. It's not about what we buy as individuals. It's not about actually even what we think about consumption of the environment or anything else. It's actually about where our power comes from and how our transport is fueled. Basically the two big things. If you think about power, a lot of the stuff that you get actually from the previous government, the new Labour government and the Tory government, about electricity use is all about waste. So you get told, don't forget to unplug your iPhone when it's finished charging up. Which, you shouldn't. You should unplug it when it's finished charging up. This is fine. But what actually makes more difference is that unplugging your iPhone or how your electricity that's charging your iPhone up is generated. It's the latter. Again, with transport, we all know yes, you're not supposed to drive a car, and indeed, yes, public transport, yay. But actually what matters much more is how your car is being fueled, how that power is getting you around, what's powering the train that you're catching. That matters much more than how many times you get on that train, actually. Again, it's about infrastructure, it's not about individual behaviour. So once we get into understanding that, then this sometimes becomes an argument about technology. This is the point at which people would say, well, it's all about, we've got to invent some new technology to have clean energy. So nuclear fusion, people will say, which I've been being told is 5 years away ever since I started campaigning on climate change, which is now about 15 years. So that 5 years away keeps getting, 5 years from now, etc. But the truth is that this isn't a technological question. And it's really interesting, actually, that you can't always get somebody saying, well, we need to put money into developing new technologies, into innovation and so on. And yeah, technologies can always be improved. But actually, there's been now several studies that show that we can generate all the electricity that we use, actually way more than the electricity that we use, from renewable sources, from the technology that we have today, right now. We can do this now. And that's not with if we only use half of what we use now or anything. We can do this today and still keep the lights on, basically. We don't have to invent anything else. And that would actually slash our carbon emissions. If we crack that where we get our power from, that's really quite a large part of the battle as far as climate change is concerned. And in fact, we have the technology to generate so much electricity from renewable sources that we could actually start switching people's heating over from gas to electricity. We could actually continue powering buses, start powering electric cars on a really large-scale way. Start actually changing the transport infrastructure with that renewable energy. We have the technology to do that. We could be doing that right now. So the question, obviously, is, well, if we have the technology to do this, why aren't we? And this is what brings me back, really, to the connections with the austerity agenda, because, of course, it's an ideological answer. There's no really good reason, there's no technical reason why we're not doing it. So it must be ideology. That's the only explanation there. See, at the moment, if you think about it, if you're green-minded and you think, right, I want to get my power from renewable sources, then yeah, sure. If you've got the money, you can do this. You can get solar panels on your house, and sometimes you can get grants, and sometimes you can't, and sometimes there's a good feed-in tariff, and sometimes there isn't, because the rules keep changing. But basically, if you've got the money, you can put solar panels on your roof, you can get renewable energy, that's fine. But of course that is only good for the people who can afford it and who own their roofs. So at the moment we have basically a market model that says, well, individuals just go out and do this themselves. They make deals with private companies and they do it, and the only role for government is to encourage people to do this. Actually, they don't have any other role in it. It's all just about individuals and the market. There are some exceptions. There's some councils. There's a council down in Southampton that's been doing some stuff with kind of getting all of their council houses in a particular estate onto renewables. But basically, it's that individual market and That's it. And the problem with that is that not only is that really unfair to people who don't have the money or don't live in a property that they own and therefore can put stuff on the roof, is that it really won't cut it, because that's just sort of micro generation. That's not transforming the infrastructure. What we need to do is transform the infrastructure. But what that needs is actual government to do it. You know, it needs a government programme where they just change all of the power stations, all of the electricity generation, all of the infrastructure, the entire national grid, over to renewable energy. They could do it. And that's what they need to do. I mean, you would basically have, it would be like when we changed to North Sea gas, which is before my time, but I heard about this, and this was actually a programme, but it had to go to every single person's house and adjust their gas appliances so they could use the new gas supply. Slightly smaller example, but actually in my lifetime, is that when we changed to Channel 5, and again, they had to employ people to go to every single person's house and set up their area so that they could get Channel 5. And it needs a programme like that for a slightly more serious reason, not to these people who like programmes on Channel 5, you know, to get us onto renewable infrastructure. But the reason they don't want to do it is that that's public sector expenditure. You know, the whole austerity agenda is about shrinking the state. And so employing a million people, millions of people to do this, is precisely the opposite of what they want to do. Now, if we were so unfortunate as to have a government minister here, what they would be saying is that, well, but you're dreaming, because that will cost billions of pounds, and we don't have billions of pounds. And of course, the answer to that is, well, first of all, we have billions of pounds to do things that the government wants to do. We have billions of pounds to bail out banks. We have billions of pounds to spend on drones to assassinate people who haven't been tried and found guilty of a crime, but who we just don't like what we think that they've done. We have billions of pounds to spend on Trident. We can do this if we wanted to. But the more important case is that actually it wouldn't cost us money. Because the point is that if you spend money on employing people, those people then have good, well-paying jobs, which means that they can go out and spend money on stuff that other people are selling them, and this is an economic stimulus. This creates demand. Actually, capitalism needs this. Part of the reason for problems we're seeing in China at the moment is there isn't enough internal demand, because people aren't paid enough to be able to afford things. So actually, what's the Million Green Jobs campaign, that the campaign against climate change has been running, and worked out, is that we can spend £19 billion and stimulate our way out of an economic crisis. And the reason the government doesn't want to do this is because they just don't see that as the role of the state. They don't want to employ people. They want to leave it up to the market. It's not because we can't afford it, it's because that's the ideological choice they're making. And I want to live in a country that can see, right, to stop the planet from being destroyed by climate fluctuations, to stop millions of people being killed by storms and floods and heat waves, we should implement this technology that we have and will work, because that is a sensible and sane thing to do for the survival long-term of the human race. I want to live in a country with a government that understands that we need to do this. And to do that, we need to be on the streets in Manchester on the 4th of October, and we also need to be on the streets in London and in Paris at the end of the year, when governments across the world are going to be gathering to talk about what they're going to do or not do about climate change. So please join those two demonstrations.
Thanks very much for inviting me. My name is Micheal Burke. I apologise to the meeting for running very late. I was held up at work. I don't propose to talk about how terrible austerity is, because as it happens, in the way of people that come to meetings that are feel against austerity, everyone tends to be against austerity. What I'm going to do instead is talk about why we have it and what the alternative is. So firstly, why we have it. Well, what we're told is that we have it because we have to get rid of the deficit. The deficit is supposed to be the overriding objective. Now, I think it's fairly easy to prove that that isn't the real objective in two ways. One of which is our actual own recent experience. Because what happened was we had a mild recovery when the last COVID was elected in 2010. It wasn't brilliant, but the economy was recovering. And what happened was they implemented austerity. The economy slowed almost to a double dip. In fact, 3 out of 4 sectors of the economy actually did go back into recession. Only the services sector carried on growing. And the result was the deficit started to rise. We don't hear much about that. The deficit started to rise in 2011, 2012. And it was all topped off, if you remember, the omni-shambles budget. The economy really did go towards zero growth, and the Tory party's poll ratings went to 30%. And so they stopped implementing new austerity measures. They didn't give up on austerity, but they stopped implementing new ones. And what happened was we had a gentle recovery. The deficit started to come down again. And then, because there was an election coming, they stoked up demand in the economy, and particularly housing. And we're living in a bubble period now related to that. But don't worry, that's going to end very soon because they're going to start implementing austerity all over again. And the deficit will rise. You know, that's a firm forecast I've made. At some point in the next couple of years, the deficit will start rising again because they've implemented austerity and the economy will slow. So austerity doesn't cure the deficit. Secondly, we know that the objective isn't deficit reduction because if we look at what they actually do, they take measures which aren't about deficit reduction at all. So the very first budget that George Osborne introduced, he hiked VAT, which disproportionately hits poorer people. It hits everybody who pays for stuff. It's valuable, but it disproportionately hits poorer people. And the Treasury's estimate of what the return from doing that was 12 to 13 billion a year. But at the same time, they cut the corporation tax rate. And the Treasury's estimate of the cost in terms of revenue foregone was about 12 to 13 billion a year. It's got nothing to do with deficit reduction whatsoever. What it's got to do with, and what the whole purpose of austerity is a transfer of income and wealth from poor to rich, from working people to big business. That's what it's about. So once we understand that, everything else about what they do, in terms of privatisation, in terms of cutting wages, in terms of cutting welfare so that they can cut corporation taxes, all fits into place. That's what they're doing. So the question is why? Because it's not about the deficit, it's actually about the transfer of incomes and wealth. Why are they doing it? And why are they doing it not just in this country, but all over the Western economies? Well, of course, it's related to the crisis that we had. From what austerity policy followed the crisis, it wasn't actually the cause of the crisis. What's the cause of the crisis? Well, all over the Western world, companies, private sector companies, stopped investing. Private companies invest because they assume they're going to make a profit. They stop investing. They're not there for public good, unfortunately. A widget maker can become a car manufacturer, or vice versa. They're not there to make widgets or cars, they're there to make profits. And if their profits drop to what below the level they deem to be acceptable, they simply stop investing. And that's what happened. The investment crisis preceded the financial crisis by about 1.5 to 2 years, depending on which country you look at. That's what really happened. So, the austerity policy isn't about reducing the deficit. It's about restoring the level of profits for companies so that at a certain point they graciously deign to invest. And so what we're living through is a period of intensifying exploitation. That's why you have pay freezes. That's why you have cuts to welfare. That's why you have hikes in VAT in order to cut corporation taxes, because we're getting that transfer. The trouble is it's not working. So we're going to do it all over again. Now, it won't work as far as growth is concerned, but that isn't their concern. It won't work as far as the deficit is concerned. That will start to rise again at some point. But that isn't their concern. What is their concern is getting the profit rate up to a level where they feel comfortable to invest again. And they will carry on doing it. There's no magic formula. They will carry on doing it until it works. You know, as someone put it, someone said about the last Tory budget, it's Captain Bligh economics. The beatings will continue until morale improves. But that's what they're aiming at. Well, once we understand that, then And the idea of what is the specific alternative sort of melts into air. Because there's as Naomi Klein says, there isn't no alternative. There's thousands of alternatives. You know, there's loads of different policies you can use. You could tax big business. You could regulate them, so they insist that they do various things, otherwise they lose their licenses to do so. You could instruct the commercial banks to invest in the real productive economy rather than speculate on the stock market, in commodities and in housing. You could nationalise industries, for example, apart from rail, I think the energy companies need to be renationalised. For a very simple reason, the lights aren't going to go out because they don't invest. Their proud boast, when Ed Miliband had this very, very modest policy of a temporary freeze in energy prices, was, oh, the lights will go out, and we've done our job because the lights haven't gone out. The reality is, when they were privatised, the spare capacity for energy production in the British economy was about 25%, i.e. they could produce 25% more than was needed at any peak time. It's gone down to about 4 to 8%, depending on whose estimate you use, and they're not investing. They're not investing in either in traditional carbon energies or in renewables, not a sufficient scale to ensure that the lights will continue to remain on. So I'm very much in favour of the renationalisation of the energy companies because we need it. And it's a whole host of things. As Sian mentioned, I was one of the people involved in putting together that letter. When it appeared in the Observer and has been roundly attacked by all the mainstream economists since. But actually, all it did was state a very obvious truth, that it's austerity that is the extreme policy, and that Jeremy Corbyn's is the sensible one, i.e. if you've got an investment crisis, the answer to it is investment. Now, they want to attack this very specific thing, which is people's quantitative easing, which is a lot of jargon, and economists are very familiar with jargon, and all jargon is used to exclude ordinary people from debate. But what that's about is simply one way of funding the necessary level of government investment. That's all, and Jeremy says it's an option. There are hundreds of options, to instructing banks, to taxing, to levies. George Osborne does levies, he does bank levies. The world doesn't fall down, capitalism doesn't come to an end, but it's because it's George Osborne saying it, not Jeremy Corbyn. But the reality is there are loads of different ways to achieve the objective. The objective has got to be to reverse the investment slump in Britain. Once you do that, once you start investing in our infrastructure, which is creaking, once you start building homes in London, and I don't have to tell a London audience about the housing crisis, once you start investing in renewable energy, once you start investing in our education system, which is not great by international standards, and we ask the people that we need for our future, and our future depends on to pay for their education, it's nuts. It's like paying for water. We do that in this country. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts. All our future prosperity depends on factors like this, on the quality of our education, the quality of our infrastructure, our trains, our renewable energy, etc., etc. And the simple reason why this comes under so much attack is very, very simple. It comes back to the source of the crisis. Because if you say that the state should invest in something, what that means is the private sector can't. The private sector can't make profits out of it. That's why privatisation is such a big part of what the government's going to do in this parliament. Because the whole purpose of what they're doing isn't about growth, isn't about the deficit, it's about boosting the profits. And what Jeremy Corbyn and many others, and Micheal and many others, argued that actually economic policy should be formed with actually improving our economy, improving our living standards, and who makes a profit out of it or how much is a very, very secondary issue. Thanks very much.
Austerity is, I think, without any question, the biggest issue in British politics. It has been for quite a long time. It continues to be. It probably is exactly the same in Western and indeed global politics. It has been, as Mick said very well, an unmitigated disaster. The loss of British output, that is something which, if we continue with the economy we've had before, but we did not install austerity, how much richer would we be is calculated at something like $250 billion. We are talking about very large sums and disaster policies. It never ceases to stagger me that just 3 months ago, the Tories won an election on the basis of the last 5 years of austerity. How did they do it? One, they said Labour was responsible for all this mess. Secondly, they said we have had to take very firm measures, but we have produced a recovery. Thirdly, we're all in it together. And fourth, do you really want to give the keys back to that lot? Well, they did give the keys back to that lot for the extraordinary reason that Labour never answered all of those charges which are absolutely fundamentally wrong. First of all, Labour did not leave the mess. I'm not saying Labour was a brilliant administration, I was never a Blairite. But the fact is, what caused it was, of course, the bankers, they precipitated it, and the international recession which followed. And indeed, Mick has given a further interpretation of that. The fact is, they said that they had used the only means possible to deal with it. That is fundamentally untrue. Let me say something at the start, which is incredibly simple and obvious, but it is not being said and not being said by the Labour Party. If you have a huge debt, and the deficit, I think in 2009 was around 155 billion. It is enormous, that's perfectly true. There are two ways of handling a debt. One is you cut expenditure, and the other is you increase income. Now, if you're an individual, you can't really do that. You can't go to your employer and say, I need another £20 a week or £50 a week. That's nonsense. But when you are the state, and when you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you control the pace and direction of the economy, and we are the 6th largest economy in the world, there are many options. And certainly the most obvious one is to expand the economy and to produce the growth and the extra jobs to make it easier to pay off the debt. But of course we know what the Tories chose. Now what Osborne never says is this. I mean, he talks continually in the House about the fact that we have the most marvellous recovery in the whole Western Hemisphere. Well, let's look at it. First of all, wages are still 6% below where they were in 2009. Secondly, productivity is flat, has been for years, and until there is an increase in productivity, there will be no significant increase in wages. Thirdly, as Mick has said at considerable length, the very important thing is that investment, private investment, I mean, of course, Osborne will have nothing to do with public investment, but private investment is really on strike. It is just not simply investing. And you make, let me ask you a question. Take the FTSE 100 companies. What are they doing with their money? And they've got quite a lot of money. How much money in cash stockpile do you think they're now sitting on today? We're talking about 100 companies. Any offers? Trillion. Again, slightly over £500 billion. £532 billion was the figure I last got from the parliamentary answer. That is a staggering amount of money. It's not as though they lack the money. They got it. What are they using it for? They use it for dividend buyback, share buyback, and for paying dividends and large management bonuses. That's what they're using it for. And why? Because they don't believe that Osborne's recovery has any legs in it. It has no sustainability. And I think they're right, for the reasons that Mick gave. The fact is that we zigzag from expansion to cut back to expansion, and that is not a way to run the economy. Fourth, if you're going to survive as any kind of nation, you actually have to pay your way in the world. You have to pay through export roughly what you're getting in imports if you expect to be able to continue with your standard of living. We had the biggest balance of payments crisis, believe it or not, since the 1830s. We are spending £100 billion a year more on imports than we are on exports. Fifthly, there is the whole question of employment. We talk as though the Tories have produced an employment miracle. The fact is, 1.8 million people are still unemployed in this country, and I don't think that's a very satisfactory situation whatsoever. And lastly, there is the question of debt, which is quite likely to be a major part of the next crash. The debt level in our country today, you think if you just compare this with it, because it's not the same, but you compare it with a household budget. We are now spending, or rather we are borrowing 40% more than what we are earning. Now you can do that for a time if you're on a major growth line, but you certainly can't do it for long. And it's growing rather than reducing. Now, the one thing that, of course, Oswald would say is that it has been worth it because we have been getting down the debt, and the debt is absolutely crushing, and until we get it down, we will never have sustainable growth. Well, let's look again. I'll just give a few figures. I'm sorry for all these figures, but they are quite important. The debt in 2009 was about, as I say, 155 billion. Alistair Darling, who was the last Labour Chancellor, did the right thing, in my view. He expanded the economy. We had 2 expansionary budgets before Labour lost the May 2010 election. As a result of that, the debt came down quite sharply. Now, budget measures take, I think it's reasonable to say, 12 to 18 months to work through the economy. It doesn't happen immediately, of course. It does take time. And if you look from the middle of 2010, when Labour lost power, to the end of 2011, the debt came down by 40 billion. But Osborne takes over and we have austerity. Within the next, we're now from 11, it's now 15, 4 years later, the deficit is still 90 billion. 90 billion. And he said in his first budget in 2010 it would be 0. It's 90. In other words, in 4 years, he's brought it down by 24 billion, 6 billion a year, whereas Alistair Darling, by expanding the economy, has brought it down by 20 billion a year. Those are very, very important figures, because I think they're the killer point in showing that austerity is simply absolutely the wrong policy. Now, what should happen? What should happen is the obvious alternative. We need a policy of expansion, of growth, of genuine, long-term, sustainable jobs. I mean, it's as clear as can be. But the reasons, well, I would add something to what Mick said about the reasons why he persisted with this policy. I agree with what Mick said, but I would also add, and Osborne has said this himself, it is the intention of the Tories to restore the size of the British state to what it was in the 1930s. He said that absolutely openly. In other words, the public sector is being squeezed to the maximum. Privatisation, both of industry and now of services, is being taken as far as it can, and we are going to have a shrunken state in order to maximise the private sector. That's the policy. Now, what should our policy be? Well, as I say, obviously expansion. Expansion how? Well, the most obvious thing is house building. Under the Tories for the last 5 years, we've actually been building half of the number of houses that we were building before, and about the level that we were in the 1920s. I mean, it is an absolute terrible scandal what is happening over housing. So that's one area for investment. Infrastructure, obviously, energy, of a low foundation economy. I mean, we can say a mass of other things, but let's just take those 3. Now, The obvious question, which Oswald has certainly raised, so I will answer them now, is, okay, how are you going to pay for it? Well, that's not too difficult. Interest rates are now at the lowest rate that they have been since the Bank of England was formed in 1694, 0.5%. And I can tell you, if you very quickly do the maths, you can get a £30 billion package at a cost of 150 million a year. Now, 150 million a year in government terms is small potatoes, where they spend 700 billion a year. So it's perfectly possible, under conventional accounting and with interest rates on the floor, to finance a package of that kind. Perfectly possible. But there are three other ways in which you can do this without any increase in public borrowing at all. The first of these is, again, as Mick was indicating, what about our banks? I mean, we're supposed to own two of them. You never guess it, because they run on entirely private sector lines to make profits for the private sector. The fact is, RBS and Lloyds could be instructed to prioritise investment in British industry. Now, let me tell you this as well. There are... how is our money? Because it is in the end our money, as well as from the wholesale market, but it is our money which is being used. Where does it go? It goes broadly in four places. One is overseas speculation. One is industrial scale tax evasion and avoidance. Another is these exotic derivatives. And I read in the FT yesterday that they're actually proposing to return to the very kind of subprime or even non-prime mortgage-backed securities which were the basic cause of the crash in the first place. I mean, it's incredible what's happening. And the other area is prime property, much of it in central London, which is another long story. But the fact is, and this is a key point, what would you think? I mean, I'm sure it's something of bandied about and dog and older where I come from, but the fact is, what would you think was the proportion of resources which actually went into productive investment in British industry, in the British economy? It is about 8 to 10%. I think in China it's over 40, and in Germany it's probably over 20. I mean, we need an absolutely fundamental change of control in the way in which our money is used. I think it is obvious where the investment needs to go. It is obvious how it can be financed. What further questions are there? I think there are 3 or 4, and I will then close. It isn't enough to have this major industrial expansion, although I think it is absolutely essential if we're going to deal with our balance of payments, keep our capacity to maintain our standard of living, etc. And if we're going to have full employment. When are we going to hear that full employment is the central objective of economic policy in this country again? That's what I want to hear, and really being carried through. But there are 2 or 3 other things which I think need to go with it. One is the banks. Our banks are totally out of control. They're far too large, they abuse the power that they have. I mean, virtually every other week we are hearing about huge scandals like mis-selling, the fixing of LIBOR, the fixing of Forex, the fixing of the gold market. I mean, these are extraordinary criminal activities which they're undertaking, which go completely unpunished, and the banks are totally unaccountable. So I think holding the banks to account, and there's a lot to say about that, I think it's very important, and to control again the money supply so that we ensure that our money, the collective investment of the British people is used in a way which is going to benefit us and not the profits of the banks, I think is essential. One other point very quickly, I think, which hasn't been mentioned but is very important, which is inequality. I mean, it is now at obscene levels. I read, again, I think it's the FT, it's their paper, it's their journal, but it's well worth listening to know what they're thinking about and what they're doing. What would you say was now the ratio in the latest pay deal, which has been reported, between the man at the top, the chief executive of one of the biggest companies, and the average paid worker in this country? What would you say the ratio was?
10 to 1.
What? 100? No, well, it's actually 183 to 1.
It wasn't that been mentioned.
Oh, I see, I think it was. No,
Parliament within companies.
yes, I mean, the point is, it's not just the basic salary. It is the long-term incentive plans.
Yeah, total package, yeah.
Well, sorry, well, let's move on. Anyway, I can assure you it's colossal. And 40 years ago, it was about 40 to 1. Well, I'm not saying what is right. I think it should be less than 40 to 1, but that's not the point. It's absolutely huge. How do you deal with it? Well, I think Jeremy is one of those, for the first time, at the top of politics, which I think he's going to be at, who is prepared to talk about having a maximum ratio between top and bottom. But there is another way, which I personally prefer, because it's more sort of organic, and I think it involves people much more closely. Why don't we say that in all our major companies, whether you take the top 100 or the top 250 or whatever, you have a meeting at least once a year, maybe twice a year, at which there is a discussion, obviously led by the management who are the leaders in this, about what is going on in the company in terms of sales, in terms of investment, in terms of depreciation, in terms of shares, in terms of acquisitions. But why shouldn't it also include pay? Why shouldn't there be a discussion in each company about pay, at which there is a discussion at which I would envisage these meetings as being representatives of each of the main grades of employment in the company. And they would have a discussion saying what they felt they were entitled to in view of the state of the company for the next year. That would include the cleaners, and it would include the chief executive and the board. And I think this transparency, opening it up, would make a hell of a difference in terms of what they felt they were able to say. Because I think if it came to any discussion, there would be such total resistance. I think it would be very difficult. Anyway, we could perhaps do both. The last thing I want to mention is this, and maybe again partly touched on this. We're not talking about nationalising the top 200 companies, whatever. What we are talking about is what works well. And certain private markets, and let me mention housing, banking, energy, water, rail, post, etc., are clearly not working well. In each case, one can set out the case that the private markets are failing this country. And in those cases, I think the public sector needs to take either a complete role, maybe in terms of energy, or a partial role. But we need to see a redrawing of those boundaries. Now, I think if we did all of those things, I am a Jeremy Corbynomics person. I think he's the best thing that has happened in my parliamentary lifetime. And thank God that these things are now seriously on the political agenda. Let's go forward.
Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership on economics in the UK.
Yeah, I think it's my kind of thing, but also Michael, about how far we can look at these things nationally. because I recently read a very interesting article by Mick, who argued that how dangerous the surplus in Germany was, because any country with a surplus, it represents another country's debt. And I think that's one point. I know after the war there was an agreement that at the end of each year there should be some kind of alignment of these debts and surpluses, which seems to have disappeared. So I'd love a comment on that. And secondly, about investment. I mean, it seems to me the main form of investment is in people. And I don't know how we can talk about things like a house building programme when this year represents the lowest on record training of building workers. There is no one to build houses. So, I mean, I think the important thing about investment is investing in people. And I can see that this massive investment that Germany is actually making in people at this very moment actually is going to increase Germany's surplus normally. I mean, so I think I'd love to have some response, something more introduction on everything.
I just wanted to ask a question in terms of the banking system and the national debt. It's something that I've sort of thought about for a long time. Why is it that though there's like a national debt and what it seems to be happening is that we're borrowing lots of money on a sort of fluctuation cycle, and then we have a recession, and then we get back into another cycle. Why is it that the banks, or we, aren't allowed to sort of say to the banks or the people in power that we don't want to take any more loans from you, but we do want you to look after our money and invest it? Why is it that there's a sort of disconnect in terms of accountability?
Shall I take a couple more and then come back, because I'm a bit worried if we keep going and bring everyone in. So if I take you, because I saw your hand, and then I'll take you, and then I'll come back, and then other hands I saw will make sure you think you're after.
Me?
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember the sort of 60s and 70s and times like that. And the economic things you're suggesting, nationalisation or whatever, isn't that different from what is sort of standard sort of Keynesian economics back in that period? And I'm just wondering, is your proposal that we return to broadly something similar to what was proposed, what was managed before, which I'm not sure is necessarily the way out, or is there something different about the economic proposals you have which, that would make it different from previously? To me, it's issue about control the economy, control the banks, and in the sense of not necessarily state control, but some form of popular control. I use that very sort of broadly. I'm just wondering what distinguishes what your proposals are now from what we had 40 years ago.
So what's your point? You're wondering with regard.
Well, I mean, what I hear from you isn't that different, I think. It's broadly sort of Keynesian, as far as I can see. Broadly, sort of what was being said back in would not have been radical back in the 60s, 70s. And nothing of what you say is particularly radical in that sense. It is radical because of where we are now. But are you proposing we go back to some sort of economic policy that we had back then, or is it something different?
And then I'm going to take you quickly, and then we'll come back to you.
I'm going to ask one, why are there private banks? Is there necessary for private banks? Just keeping money, or printing money by the state, and giving people, they borrow it to people. And second question is, house building, yes, but by who? I believe it should be by councils and should be affordable rent for the lowest payer workers.
So they come back to our panel.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll take up some of these and not all of them, because otherwise I'll be I'll get thrown out boring you. couple of things I want to take up, and if people feel we haven't dealt with them, then by all means come back or whatever. Investment in people, I very much agree with this. The world's leading, there's a branch of economics called econometrics, and it's very abused because people use it to fit. They fit data, they fit models to get the answers they want. But instead of that, there's actually two of the world's leading econometricians are, one of them's a registered Republican in the US, Dale Jorgensen, and he's probably the leading econometrician in the world, and he produces superb work because he actually doesn't create a model and then get the world to fit the model and ignore the bits that aren't helpful. He actually starts with the world and then examines what actually goes on. Anyway, he and his colleague, a guy called Hong Wu, they've done this brilliant work and they've actually analysed what causes growth. Because what we're very used to in this country is seeing output of growth, you know, household consumption, business investment, government consumption or investment, and net exports. They actually talk about what drives growth, and it's brilliant stuff. And for advanced industrialised countries like Britain, 57% of all growth is accounted for by investment, and about 37 or 38% of it is accounted for by, there's a horrible phrase some people use called human capital, but it's actually the growth of labour, supply, and its quality. And the quality is crucial because it's labour supply doesn't really grow that much in advanced countries, in some cases it's falling. It's about how well educated the workforce is. It's very interesting as well. The remainder is tiny, and they reckon that there's no or little or no factor of growth accounted for by entrepreneurial activity. So you could shoot all the entrepreneurs in the world. But the Richard Bransons of the world provide that. They provide no value whatsoever. The value in the economy added to it is by what we invest and how we grow the economy through the quality of education and training. So I very much agree with the point about housing. You also need apprenticeships, you need engineers, you need quantity surveyors. I love my buildings, that's how that's the job I used to do. I used to work on building sites. And all those activities you need to train people. You also need things like cement factories and brick factories, and they've shrunk in this country. There are lots of them are closed because we keep having these massive down cycles in house building. So you need to invest. You do need to invest. You can't just have the training. And then I wanted to sort of relate that to one other question, which is what's the difference between what we're saying? So I think we're all coming at it from different angles, but fundamentally in agreement. And what happened in the 60s and 70s? Well, first thing I would say is the 60s and 70s weren't so bad compared to now. They were a lot better than that, actually. Growth in this high government spending, Keynesian so-called period, I don't have much to do with Keynes, and high trade union membership, and all the rest of it, and the union barons who were running the country. Actually, growth was actually quite a bit stronger than it has been for the last, since Thatcher. That's the first point, so things weren't so bad. But the trouble with the previous nationalisation was they rescued sectors of the economy which had failed, and then they didn't invest. British Leyland didn't arise because the government wanted to start building cars. It's because all the British car companies were failing, and they had to take them over and merge them. Same with the railways, same with the mines. They were all nationalised because they'd failed. And the government had to take them over. The trouble was they didn't invest in them. What happened is they became increasingly uncompetitive because there wasn't sufficient level of investment. And what we're saying now, and obviously even as your question implies, the difference is context. There's a world of difference between saying you must nationalise things because you're actually rescuing the private sector, and actually I'd like to nationalise some sectors of the economy to rescue the economy. I think that's the difference. I'll do very briefly on house building. I'm very much in favour of councils building houses. I'm very much in favour of the state building houses. Very simple reason. It costs the state about a quarter of what it does the private sector to build the same house. For a very simple reason, is no developer anywhere in the world gets back taxes. They don't get them. They don't get taxes back in the construction of the houses. The state does. So as a result, the net cost to the state is about a quarter of what it is to the private sector. And therefore, the state can really easily afford to build affordable homes, whereas the private sector can't, because it must make a profit.
Well, I thought I'd start actually also with house building, because that's a particularly good question around here, seeing all the building going on just around this community centre. And also kind of as an illustration really of how the private sector doesn't build the houses that we need. I mean, those towers kind of down that way. Some of those flats are on Whitewood for £1 million. I mean, who around here can afford £1 million for a flat? That's absurd. And that's not supplying the housing that actually local people need around here. It's just supplying the housing that will make profits for probably the developer and also for the people who will buy it. Because that's, of course, the other side of this. That, you know, we understand that, okay, we don't have enough houses available, but it's not really that. Because actually a lot of this housing is being built not for someone to live in, not even for the person who buys it to rent out for someone else to live in, but just to sit empty as an investment. So it's not actually, you know, homes for people at all anymore. It's just another place to put spare capital for those who have it. So I think as well as actually house building by governments and councils, what we need to have is a programme of compulsory purchase or just requisition of empty homes and refurbishing of buildings so that they can be lived in. Because actually, I mean, there's been studies, the Greenwich did a study quite some years ago, that showed that if you just brought in back into occupation every empty house in London, and that was just housing, it wasn't talking about empty office blocks or anything like that, just houses, that you would be able to house every single person on the council house waiting list in London, and actually still have some left over. So, you know, if we started doing that, we would actually not have a housing crisis. I think the point about TTIP is a very good one, because obviously what we're saying, I think we're all saying nationalisation in various industries, and of course that's precisely what TTIP wouldn't allow us to do. So I think the campaign against TTIP and getting it out there and making sure people understand what this means is really important. So thanks for mentioning that. The other thing I wanted to address was the point about well, can we deal with this nationally? Because you're right, of course, you know, capitalism is a global system. What we do actually is influenced by and influences what other countries do. In a way, looking at it just as sort of nationally, as if we're kind of in a box and not affected by anything outside that, is kind of absurd. That's absurd economically, and it's also absurd environmentally. That, you know, a large part of the discussions about how much greenhouse gas emissions the UK is responsible for is kind of complete rubbish, because we don't, as Mike and Mike have said, we don't produce anything. So, you know, most things that are made for us to consume are made in Hong Kong, are made in China. So actually their emissions aren't their emissions, they're our emissions, because they're producing emissions from making stuff for us. So just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions from the UK kind of doesn't make a lot of sense unless you factor that in. So it's true that it's a global system, but I think the point is that what we in this room can do is actually influence what happens here in this country, because that's where we are. So it's not parochial to focus on the national bit while being aware that we're talking about a global system, because this is what, hopefully, we have the power to change.
I think most of it has been said, I won't repeat it, but I will draw on the question about going back to the 60s, 70s. Because I agree with Mick that actually things were an awful lot better. And again, if you want that made clear, if you take the quarter century between 1948 and 1973, which was something called the period of regulated capitalism, as compared with the period after Thatcher came to power in 1979 until 2007, that quarter century of totally unfettered, freewheeling, deregulated capitalism, what was the increase in the average income as a proportion of total income in those two periods, and it's very instructive. In the first period, which is now has been completely denigrated, it was 2.4%. An average individual could expect to have an increase in income of 2.4% a year. In the period after Thatcher came to power, it was 1.7. Now that's very, very significant in my view. What that indicates is that the idea that this period in which capitalism or the markets rule, because basically the factor which underlies the dominant ideology in Britain and the West is let the markets do it, give the markets full power and government get out of the way because it's always inefficient and always makes a mess of things. Well, how do you reconcile that with the figures that I've just given? Can I just say a word about TTIP? Because there are some important things that I think need to be said about this. Ever since the social democratic revolution after the war, following the 1930s, when the ideas of social democracy and regulating capitalism were very strong and the right were not able to resist them, they had been seeking to push back, and it was only in the 1970s the huge increase in oil prices for reasons to do with the Middle East, of course, which really defenestrated the Keynesian model. And the right, and Thatcher was very lucky to come to power at this time, was in a position to provide an alternative ideology, and that is what they did. But they are still, in order to once again increase their profits, looking to areas where they are blocked. And they are blocked by international agreements, ILO agreements, on labour safeguards, environmental safeguards, which have been accumulated not just in terms of climate change after Kyoto, but a whole range of policies which agree between nations at international conferences to protect the environment in the interests of all. That's what they're targeting. That's what they now want to get rid of. Because they say it's about getting rid of tariffs. Tariffs are incredibly low. They're basically around 3%. That's not the problem. That's not what they're really aiming at. And of course, the other thing which is absolutely crucial here is that they're aiming at public services, including the health services. I certainly believe there is no question that if this goes through, this is a very, very, very big issue. If this goes through, we will lose control of the capacity to recover the National Health Service that we've had in this country. Now, the National Health Service that we've had in this country is not perfect. And of course, like everything else, it needs to be continually assessed and reformed. I'm all in favour of that. But the really key thing is the values and principles that lie behind it. And that is what is now at risk. Because if we lose this battle, I think it's going to be very difficult. I wouldn't say impossible. I don't think anything in politics is impossible or settled forever. But it'll be very difficult to change it back. The other point I want to make about is banks' accountability. I mean, you're absolutely right, of course, that the whole momentum of capitalism is towards expansion, and then it reaches itself, and then you get a counter effect into a deep recession. And after a time, the economy inevitably recovers. Now, what you're saying is, how do we make sure that the banks are more accountable in terms of what is so damaging? Well, of course, this is implicit in capitalism. You have to change the system. It's not just the banks. You can ameliorate it, and Keynesianism was exactly intended to do that. And to some extent, it does succeed. But we've now developed this problem over and above it, that the banks, instead of acting in the public interest, instead of acting in our interest, have really become systems, they're profit machines in their own right. I mean, they are seeking ways in terms of investment abroad, use of the wholesale markets, a whole range of scams of the most extensive and really criminally driven. That's the only way you can put it. They know they're acting wrongly. And actually, to change the LIBOR system, the London overnight offer rate is really extraordinary. I mean, it affects, so I'm told, I'm no expert in this, but something like 300 trillion. What did you say that it was? It's in trillions. I mean, it's trillions across the whole world. It takes £1,000, they're likely to end up in prison. I mean, these people are affecting the financial consequences of literally billions of people, and they go totally unpunished. So you are raising a correct point that accountability of the banks is very, very important. And the only way you can really secure that is through public ownership, and that is what I strongly favour.
Can I just quickly add to that in terms of the ownership of banks? I think my emphasis is also in terms of it's the taxes and the national insurance that doesn't go into services or into making anything. It's actually our taxes that goes to the banks to pay the debts. That's why they should be accountable to the population and not the other way around in terms of scooping up from the public.
I agree with that point. I've spoken long enough and other people, but it's a very good point.
I think one of the good questions I tell a story. A few years ago, we passed the motion Islington South Labour Party constituency to serve two purposes: to keep the budget and to melt down the Wills bubble, which was inheritance tax, progressive, 100% everything about 1 million. Inheritance tax on inheritance above 1 million is practically confiscated. That will immediately raise enough money for the budget to pay all the debts. And at the same time, fight inequality.
I think it's interesting to hear people talking about different, possibly economic programs at one end. I think I've also been involved in the 1 million climate jobs campaign that Elaine has been talking about. I think they're all very good sets of policies and sets of ideas, but I think that one of the problems that we come up against in a lot of these kinds of discussions is we never really get to the point where we talk about how we make them happen. What is the kind of agency that brings them about? The most inspiring thing that I've seen in the last couple of weeks, and as exciting as everything around Jeremy Corbyn has been, and I really hope that he wins on the weekend, has been what's happened with around the migrant crisis. Not the fact that somehow there was like some sort of gradual persuasion of people to, take serious this issue. What happened was tens of thousands of migrants have torn down the borders. They've marched right across the racist immigration policies of the European Union. They've taken their destiny in their own hands. It's been absolutely inspiring, and it's transformed the situation around them. And so I think I look at that and I wonder, what does that say to us about the way that we're going to try and change things? Because I do kind of worry that when I hear some of the discussions now, I almost get a feeling that really what we're saying is that our best hope is that in 5 years' time, Jeremy Corbyn will win the election, and that has to be the focus of what we do. And what I worry about that is that it can be very demobilising, or it can lead people to think that the main argument or the main sphere over the next 5 years is a battle between left and right within the Labour Party. I'm more interested in trying to think through what things we can do as a movement. When I think about, people talked a lot about the 60s and the 70s. One of the important things about the 60s and the 70s isn't just government policy, but it's the fact that there was a strong, militant, well-organised trade union movement that was able to fight for reforms, that was able to fight for better living standards and whatnot. I think it would be fantastic, for example, if Jeremy and everyone around him told all these hundreds of thousands of new people who joined up to vote for him and to support him, to go and join a trade union, to become a shop steward or a trade union rep, and to find in their workplaces to organise and to build a stronger trade union movement. And I think that when we go up to Manchester in a few weeks, if all these hundreds of thousands of people are going to be there, and we can make a call for them to be there, and Jeremy can make a call for them to be there, we should be looking at shutting down the Tory party conference. And, you know, for us to actually be tearing down the fences and saying it doesn't have to be this way. And I think if we're ambitious and if we're thinking along those lines about how we rebuild at the base, how we have a forum to discuss those things, but also how we use these big and important changes at the top to, you know, throw the influence of the left much wider, then we could be in for a really exciting couple of years.
We've had austerity now for 5 years, and as you've shown, the consequences seem obvious and negative. But nonetheless, it's still very much in vogue in both politics and economics, and it would seem to be the dominant ideology. Why do you think that is?
That's a good bombshell.
Yeah, a few quick points really. I think just to emphasise again, I do think it's very important when people go on this protest in Manchester. There's coach tickets from Enfield, Harrogate and Islington that people can buy. We've got Enfield and Islington ones on sale tonight. But it is very important. But I think it would be wrong to see the Corbyn campaign, what it represents in terms of alternatives to austerity, as some sort of parliamentary game or something at the top. In fact, the Corbyn campaign, the whole political dynamic Jeremy has given that, and the exceptional leadership he's given that from a left perspective, is a massive flowering further of the anti-austerity movement in a different dimension and with a different dynamic. And if you look at the alliance that Jeremy Corbyn has been able to build in the Labour Party, and hopefully will lead him to win on Saturday, as long as they don't keep banging at people until he doesn't win. That is primarily based around opposition to austerity and opposition to cuts, and that is the primary motivating factor. So I think it's a bit of a danger on the left at every point to be thinking all the time on the organised left, oh, how can we be more radical than Jeremy? How can we start criticising Jeremy before he's even started his process? In fact, what Jeremy's done is unleashed a massive wave from the grassroots, which I think can now be used to reinforce the People's Assembly movement, which again can reinforce the left within the Labour Party. I think those things aren't mutually exclusive, they're working on each other. So that would be my point. My question would be something about which what we have to talk about is what we would like to do with the banks if we did run them. We just say they should invest. But what I'd like to know actually is if the came back, say, have been nationalised for a number of years and then sold off, actually, what would be like 2 or 3 key election headline policies that we could use to nationalise banks that we already own before that could win that election for Labour if Corbyn was there?
So that's all time for questions, I'm afraid. I'm going to just make a couple of announcements. So, as Matt said, there's tickets on sale for coaches at the back to Manchester. Elaine and a couple of people mentioned that actually when the government wants to find money, it can. And one of the things that it always finds money for is war. So I'm just going to announce that there's a rally to stop the spread of war, end war at home, defend Muslims, migrants, refugees and our communities. That's coming up on the 22nd of September, so there's details here if you want it. And I'm just going to quickly mention that it's been alluded to by a few kind of comments from the table and from the floor about the kind of need for trade unions to unite in the workplace and how we win better wages. But obviously this government is sort of systematically dismantling ways of resistance. So we've seen incursions into our civil liberties, and coming up next week is the second reading, the first vote in the House of Parliament on the trade union bill, which will make it nearly impossible for people to go on strike, and contains a range of measures that will just strip employment protections from people and really reduce the influence of trade unions even further. So it's really important that we lobby our MPs to make sure that we try and get that bill, because otherwise we're in an even, it's easier to be exploited if you don't have a trade union on your side. If you go to the TEC website, there's a lobby your MP tool. So I'm just going to hand it back to our speakers for very quick final comments. I'll start with Elaine and we'll go through that we did before.
Okay, so I just wanted to come back first of all on the question of why is the ideology of austerity so dominant. I mean, partly it's as a wise man said, the thoughts of the ruling class are ruling thoughts. So this is, if we have the government and up until very recently, all the opposition parties all saying that we need some degree of austerity, that tends to be therefore people think, well, this must be true then. And then of course this becomes something that's reported in the media as being, well, of course we need austerity, so that's then what people are faced with on the TV news, when they read the paper or whatever. So therefore this becomes just something that kind of people assume is correct. But I think I want to question the sort of the assumption behind the question a bit, because you see, I'm not sure that even with all of that weight of government and received opinion saying that austerity is what we need, I'm not sure that it is actually so dominant. I mean, I'm sure people here will have had similar experiences, but I mean, when we first started campaigning against the cuts, before even People's Assembly existed, when you do a street stall against the cuts, you would have a lot of people coming past and saying, oh, but we've overspent, we have to balance the budget, it's like the household budget, Mrs. Merkel and her handbag, all of that stuff. And I think it's been a good 2 years since somebody said that to me on the street. Actually, most people now are quite open to questioning the idea that we need austerity. I think we've actually won that argument with all but a kind of an embittered minority who come up and shout at you in Enfield Town, but you always get them to notice that. But basically, I think actually we've turned public opinion around. I think people actually do understand that when we're being told by the government that we have to have austerity, that basically they're lying to us. So I think, you might hear this on the BBC, but don't despair when they keep saying, oh, we need austerity, because I think we don't believe it, and I think most people out there don't believe it anymore. The other thing I wanted to address, I mean, obviously the question of how do we get from the theory to actual change is a huge one which we could discuss for days and days and days, so to sum it up very, very quickly. I think obviously it's incredibly important to have theoretical discussions like this because, and particularly really with this issue, because so much of what the government's doing is actually not telling the truth about why they're doing what they're doing. We do have to have the opportunity for people who know about it to unpick it for us. Otherwise we can't have the argument with people on the street and explain actually what's going on. So I think that's really vital. But you're absolutely right that just discussion on its own isn't enough. And I think you're also right really that we don't have 5 years. No, but I don't think anyone is really planning to just wait until Germany sweeps to power. But in case anyone's trying to do that, we can't, because the state that the country will be in 5 years will be absolutely unimaginable. We don't want to be there. We have to defeat this government now. And I think actually what we need to be doing is getting out on the street. And you're right to pick up the refugee crisis, because that's really shown the power of public opinion. It's not just the migrants themselves. I mean, that was, you're right, that was incredibly inspiring. But it was actually also the very loudly expressed public opinion in places like Germany, where you have football fans, the most right-wing section of society often, with enormous banners saying refugees welcome here. When people have the opportunity to express their opinion like that, then governments tend to say, oh, we were planning to let them in all along. So this is why Manchester is so important, because this really is our opportunity to change things. It's not just a ritual, it's not just a fun day out or a fun week out. This is actually how we defeat the government and how we get change. So, buy your coach tickets.
Nick, very quickly.
Yeah, very briefly. I think that the quickest way to demoralise people is for them to believe that they can't change anything. And one of the best ways to energise people in all the different campaigns and struggles they go through is to believe that they can change things. And I think, as I hope, that Jeremy Corbyn is the next leader of the Labour Party. I think that will give an enormous boost to everyone campaigning on all the issues that probably we generally agree on. And I don't think that the movements and the leadership of a major political party that agree with us are counterposed. I think they're all part of the same thing. So we should carry on with our campaigns, our protests. And it's quite important to have the possibility, at least, of a government that is on our side. Because we had lots of protests, we had lots of strikes in the 70s, and they all went down to defeat, as I remember. Because the Labour government and the Tory government shared the same views that these weren't going to be successful. The very first government that brought in the IMF to this country was a Labour government. Completely spurious crisis. It wasn't a crisis. It's they wanted to crush the unions. They wanted to drive down the living standards. They wanted the very first baby step on the road to austerity that we have now. So we do need at least the possibility of a government that can change things for the better. And I think we must carry on with our protests. And I think the election of Jeremy Corbyn's leader will bring more people into our movement.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I think it is very important to realise this. We're going to hear the result in 3 days. But that is not the end. That is the beginning of the beginning. And it's what follows through after that which is so important. And if I can take up the question about why is the right still so dominant, well, there are very good reasons for that, because the right, probably in Britain, is better embedded than in probably any other country in Western Europe, largely because we have not suffered invasion and conquest for 1,000 years, whereas other countries have and have produced very different results. But the right is dominant because there is a very powerful nexus between not just the politicians, who in my view are no longer the most powerful group in Britain. It is finance, the hedge fund, private equity, who I would say are even more dominant, and of course the media, which as a result of the awful influence of Murdoch has emerged as a very powerful political force. Now I would say that the other reason it's so powerful is because the Labour Party was taken over by the Blairites in 1994, and I'm not sure, I'm not accusing them of villainy. I think they sincerely believed it, but they moved the Labour Party into what is in effect a subversion of the Tory Party. We're not the same as the Tory Party, I wouldn't say that, but in terms of the dominant ideology, the deregulation of finance, the support for freewheeling capitalism, the shift towards privatisation, the suppression of the unions, the Blairite vision was exactly the same as the Tories, and that's why they're so strong. But that's why I feel more excited, more positive than I have ever felt in my political life at this time, because I think that right dominance, which has been there for the last 30 years, is now seriously going to come under challenge. I think Jeremy Corbyn is a sort of anti-politician, which is why he's so popular. He doesn't behave in the way that other politicians do, which is to say what you want me to say and I'll say it with a smile. He says what he really believes, he's deeply authentic, he has integrity, and he has a policy which I think has been crying out to be delivered in this country. So I think the right has got to watch out. And all their ideas that Jeremy Corbyn is a joke, I think are going to be very, very, they're going to be laughing on the other side of their face. Now can I just say something about inheritance tax? I just want to tell you, it has never been particularly progressive. Do you know the number of families who are actually subject to it and therefore gain the advantage of these reductions, raising the threshold to 1 million? It is 6%. 94% of people were omitted. It's certainly not, and never has been, a very progressive tax. But of course what the Tories are doing is making it even less so. And the other point that I would make, which partly concerns this question of dominance of the right, there is, I can tell you, a lot of thought at the present movement in the Corbyn team, or whatever you call it, or us, about building the base. I mean, there is still a strong trade union base. It has been much reduced by Thatcher. It's about a quarter of the population. It was, I think, well over 40. But it is still strong, but we need a social movement independent of the trade union movement. Because they are the two parts, the political and the trade union side. And I can tell you a lot of thought has gone into this, not just thought, but in the course of this campaign, there are something like 100,000 people who have signed up, which is a very large number of people. 550,000 people took part in this election. And we have done our best to ensure that we retain contact with them, because it is not just a matter of winning an election and Jeremy Corbyn being made leader. He can't do very much unless we actually also support him. We need him and he needs us. And that, I think, is a lesson which we are very seriously trying to learn. The last one I make is about the trade union bill, because that really sums up everything that the Tories are about. It is incredible. They're requiring a 40% turnout in all potential industrial action and 50% in the case of certain public services. No MP under that law, or very few MPs, a handful of MPs, would be elected in the House of Commons. It is discriminatory and it is designed to destroy the trade union and labour movement. And we need action as soon as we can, and continuing right through to the election, showing our total opposition to this. I mean, the other point about it is that it is, just to show the example of it, it is criminalising picketing if it goes beyond certain statutory guidelines. You're allowed to have 6 people picketing, and they are making, okay, I'm going to finish. And they are proposing that if you have a 7th, that person can be subject to a criminal offence. I mean, the degree of this is going back to where we were in the 1920s. So, anyway, I think it has been a good meeting. I've enjoyed it. It always raises my spirits. But don't think Saturday is the end. It's the beginning of what can be the most marvellous revival we've known in our political lives.